And this is a continuation of Chapter 13, Part 2. On your document, you have a terminology review. I'd like for you to make sure that you're familiar with all those terms. We start with spinal tracts, and remember that a tract is a bundle of axons that is in the central nervous system. It would be called a nerve if it was in the peripheral nervous system. The spinal tracts are both ascending and descending, and the fibers in any given tract are going to have a similar origin, a similar destination, and a similar function. Now we've got the ascending tracts. Those are moving toward the brain. Those are carrying sensory information. We have the descending tracts. Those are carrying motor information, and they are carrying that motor information from the brain. So those are running down the spinal cord. Decussation is crossing of those tracts through the nerve cord. So they cross over to the other side. That's why if someone has a stroke and the stroke is on the right side, then they may lose control of their body on the left side because of the crossing over of those tracts. When that crosses over, that's called contralateral. And so we're talking opposite sides of the body, and we've used this term before. Ipsilateral is when they stay on the same side of the body. Now, continuing on, I've asked you to talk about first, second, and third order neurons. In the ascending tracts, those sensory signals generally travel across 3 neurons from the beginning at the receptors to the end, to their destination. A first order neuron is going to be the one that detects the stimulus, transmits the signal to the spinal cord or the brainstem. A second order neuron continues that pathway from the first to the thalamus in the brain, and we're going to do brain next chapter. Our third order neuron carries that signal from the thalamus all the way to the cerebral cortex. Now, in the descending tracts, the motor signals are carried from the brainstem in a pathway that usually has 2 neurons involved. And the first one is called the upper neuron. It's from the motor cortex of the brainstem. The second one is the lower neuron, and it innervates the muscle or the target organ. Here again, we have the picture with the ascending tracts and the descending tracts. Remember, this is white matter. These are myelinated neuron bundles. Let's talk about the anatomy of a nerve. Remember, a nerve is the same as a tract, except a nerve is in the peripheral nervous system, a tract is in the central nervous system. Some of these things we've seen already. These are the rootlets. We have the posterior root ganglion here. It's also called the dorsal root ganglion. We have the posterior root, also called the dorsal root. Anterior root, also called ventral root. When those roots are together in this area, we have what is called the actual spinal nerve. The spinal nerve is itself not very long because it's going to immediately branch into dorsal and ventral branches. When we look up close at the cross-section of the spinal nerve, we see that we have an epineurium. We have fascicles within that nerve, and the fascicles are covered with the connective tissue, the perineurium, right here. And then you can see that we have in a fascicle different nerve fibers, and that the endoneurium is around the individual fiber. What you're seeing here are unmyelinated and myelinated nerve fibers. Here we have a pic of a real cross-section of a nerve, and you can see this connective tissue surrounding the nerve called the epineurium. You can see that it's divided into fascicles. Each fascicle is surrounded by the perineurium, and then within each fascicle we have the actual nerve fibers, and they are surrounded by endoneurium. You can see the blood vessel running through that nerve. Here again's another pic, just epineurium, then your perineurium around your fascicles. Here are blood vessels. The endoneurium around the actual axons, the nerve fibers, and this particular axon has myelin sheath. I asked you to list and describe types of nerve fibers, and these are types of nerves with particular fibers. So we have sensory nerves that are afferent. Those have sensory fibers in them, afferent fibers. We have motor nerves that have motor fibers in them, or efferent fibers, carrying the signal from the central nervous system. Then we have somatic fibers, we have visceral fibers, we have general fibers that go to muscles and skin and glands and the viscera and so on. And then the special fibers that are going to be related to the special organs like your eyes and ears and nose and so on. When we look at these fibers in nerves, if a nerve has only afferent fibers, it's a totally sensory nerve. If it has only efferent fibers, it is a totally motor nerve. If it is a nerve that contains afferent and efferent fibers, we call it a mixed nerve. And then, like I said before, both sensory and motor fibers can be somatic or visceral, general or special. Earlier in your document, I asked you to describe ganglia. Ganglia, you recall, are clusters of neurosomas. They're outside the central nervous system, so they are in the peripheral nervous system. They're covered by endoneurium. They're continuous with the nerve. What we have among those neurosomas will be some nerve fibers leading in and out of that ganglion. The one that we've looked at the most, and I'm going to show you a picture of again, is our posterior or dorsal root ganglion. This is it. And you see all of these neurosoma, the nerve cell bodies. And if you look closely, you can see that these are unipolar nerves. That's because these are sensory nerves coming through that dorsal root ganglion. Let's look again at the components of a spinal nerve. First of all, here's your nerve cord, and it's encased in your meninges and then bone. When we have that sensory impulse, here are the dorsal rootlets heading into the nerve cord. Here's the dorsal root heading into the dorsal rootlets. This is that dorsal root ganglion that has all of those cell bodies that are sensory. Now we have the message coming out from the nerve cord, and here a part of the spinal nerve are the ventral rootlets heading into the ventral root, and then where you have the dorsal and ventral root combine is where we actually have the spinal nerve. Okay, we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. We have 8 cervical nerves, that's C1 through C8. We have 12 thoracic, T1 through T12, 5 lumbar, L1 through L5, 5 sacral, S1 through S5, and 1 coccygeal. Here you're seeing some of the cervical nerves. Look at the yellow part. That yellow is the actual spinal nerve where those roots are together. Okay, here you can see those dorsal and ventral roots. Here and here. Here we see those dorsal root ganglia. You can see where the rootlets are attached to the spinal cord. Here you can actually see rootlets. And then this pic is showing you the cauda equina, which is formed from the roots that come from L2 to CO1. This pic is showing you all of those spinal nerves. We haven't talked about plexuses yet, but we will. You've been asked to label this pic, and we are going to talk about some of the structures. First of all, let's look at what we know already. Here, of course, is your spinal cord. And then on your actual nerve roots, you'll recall this is your dorsal root or posterior root, and it's sensory. The neurosomas are located in the posterior dorsal root ganglion right there. Then we have your anterior or ventral root. The neurosomas are located in the ventral horn gray matter of the spinal cord. Now, as we see right here, those two roots are together, and that is the spinal nerve proper. And then it immediately branches. Here we have our posterior or dorsal ramus. And that posterior or dorsal ramus is going to supply the muscles and the joints in the region of the spine where this comes out, and also the skin of the back. Then you have the much larger anterior or ventral ramus, and this anterior or ventral ramus is going to supply all the rest of the body. In the thoracic area, it becomes intercostal nerves. Everywhere else, it joins with others to form a plexus that we're going to talk about. What else do we see on this? We see the meningeal branch coming off of the spinal nerve. The meningeal branch actually is going to re-enter the vertebral canal. It's going to innervate the meninges. It's going to innervate the vertebrae. We have coming off of this anterior ramus, we have what your text is calling communicating rami, or they're also called rami communicantes. One of them is gray, one of them is white, and they join with a ganglion that is your sympathetic ganglion. So all of this right in here is autonomic nervous system, and we'll get to the details on that in another chapter. Let's examine all of these rami again. So here we have the spinal nerve, and here is the dorsal rami. You can see supplying the muscle and the skin of the back. You see then this huge ventral ramus, and the ventral ramus, like I said, is going to branch into plexuses and supply the rest of the body. We have here your gray rami communicantes and your white rami communicantes. Remember, those are autonomic nervous system, as is this sympathetic ganglion. Here you can see the dorsal rami, they are small, and the ventral rami, much larger. This is a pic of the thoracic region, and you can see here where we have the dorsal rami and the ventral rami. You can also see the sympathetic chain ganglion. You can see that better over here. It's right here. It's just a chain of sympathetic ganglia, and we have our gray and white rami communicantes here, coming off from and then re-entering the anterior ramus of the spinal nerve. This pic is on page 3 of your document, and I've labeled the dorsal ramus. That's what A is pointing to. The ventral ramus is what B is pointing to, and the rami communicantes, or communicating rami, are C. So, contains autonomic nerve fibers. That's where we get into our rami communicantes. Supplies the posterior body trunk. This is your dorsal ramus. Remember, it goes into your back. It supplies your muscles and skin. Supplies all of the body except the posterior, and that's going to be your ventral ramus, and it is large. All but T2 through T12 branch to form nerve plexuses. In the thoracic region, we don't have nerve plexuses, but everywhere else, this ventral ramus becomes nerve plexuses. Supplies each muscle with fibers from more than one nerve, and that's because of the plexuses, and that also is your ventral ramus. Okay, a nerve plexus. This is where that anterior ramus, or all the anterior rami, branch, and then they anastomose, or come together. Branch and come together, branch and come together. They form 5 nerve plexuses. Your first one is your cervical plexus, that's C1 to C5. That's going to supply your neck and your phrenic nerve, which is supplying your diaphragm and allowing you to breathe. Your brachial plexus is pretty complex. It's C5 to T1. It supplies your upper limb, some of your shoulder and neck, and then the median nerve, that carpal tunnel nerve, is in this plexus. Your lumbar plexus, lower back, L1 to L4, supplying your abdominal wall, anterior thigh, genitalia, and then we consider these two together, sacral and coccygeal plexuses. They are L4 to the end, and they supply the remainder of the lower trunk and lower limb. So what do these plexuses do? Well, they have a somatosensory function. That is, they're carrying those sensory signals from bones, joints, muscles, skin. They are responsible for a lot of the proprioception, that is, the information the brain receives about the position your body is in. And then they have a motor function, and that simply is to stimulate muscles to contract. Here is your cervical plexus. Look at this, hypoglossal nerve. Remember the hypoglossal canal? Here we have it again. This one is pointing out something that is vital, and that's the phrenic nerve. Now remember, these nerves occur in pairs. Your phrenic nerve innervates your diaphragm, so injury to this can prevent you from being able to breathe. Here's your brachial plexus. It is quite complex. You see it has roots. They join to make trunks, then they divide again to make anterior divisions and posterior divisions. Then they join again to make cords, and then we have divisions that are the actual nerves. These are nerves that you need to know for lab. Here is the median nerve that is responsible for carpal tunnel syndrome. Here is the lumbar plexus, and you'll see that we have the roots and the anterior and posterior divisions there. Here we have it again, And you can see that it's highlighted in this cadaver pic. These are some of the nerves that you will also need to know for lab. Here we have the sacrococcygeal, and we've got roots, we've got anterior and posterior divisions, but our big one here is the sciatic nerve. And this is anastomosis of the common fibular and the tibial. And again, these are nerves that you need to know for lab. Here we have a pic again, and you see the cadaver highlight. Some nerve injuries. We have radial nerve injury, because that passes through the axilla. That's called crutch paralysis. So you're putting the pressure on your armpit. And if you injure that, you end up with wrist drop. Again, that sciatic nerve, sciatica, is a really, really painful condition along the gluteal region, down the thigh, leg, to the ankle. 90% of the cases are either going to be osteoporosis of the lower spine or a herniated disc. Again, emphasizing those phrenic nerves. If there's an irritation, it causes spasms of the diaphragm. We call them hiccups. If both of them are severed or become injured, then we have the diaphragm being paralyzed. You cannot breathe. Back in the day when polio was in this country, sometimes that virus would attack those phrenic nerves and would paralyze the diaphragm, and individuals would have to live in what we call an iron lung that would change the pressure around the thorax and allow them to breathe. Now let's look at these. The obturator and femoral nerves branch from this plexus. That's going to be lumbar. Striking the funny bone, that's when you hit your ulnar nerve, and that causes that tingling, and that's from the brachial plexus. Trauma to this one will cause wrist drop. Again, that's the brachial. Fall or improper administration of an injection in the butt can injure this one, and that's your sacral plexus. And then, of course, here we have again our phrenic nerve branches from the cervical plexus. A dermatome is a specific area of skin that conveys the sensory input to a spinal nerve. And we have dermatome maps. That is, it's a diagram of the areas innervated by the spinal nerves. Dermatomes overlap, sometimes as much as 50%. So it's necessary to anesthetize 3 successive spinal nerves to produce total loss of sensation in one dermatome. Here's your dermatome map. We've got the cervical nerves, the thoracic, the lumbar, and the sacral. Let's talk about some more things that can go wrong. Shingles is a herpes virus. It's the same virus that causes chicken pox when you're a kid. And in the chicken pox, you have a really itchy rash, but it generally clears up, except the virus does not leave your body. It lives. It lies dormant in your posterior or dorsal root ganglion. Then, later in life, if something occurs to activate that virus, then what you may experience is shingles, and that virus travels along those nerves and causes great pain and itching. 2 other very serious disorders, polio and ALS. Both of them are destruction of the motor neurons that lead to skeletal muscles. In polio, we're looking at motor neurons in the brainstem and we're talking about causing lack of impulses down the phrenic nerves, and we can have respiratory arrest. In some individuals, the virus does not affect the phrenic nerves, but affects nerves that supply your muscles and so on. And so individuals can become crippled. ALS, also called Lou Gehrig's disease, is destruction of motor neurons, and consequently the muscles atrophy. We can also have some sclerosing of the spinal cord. Astrocytes. Something goes wrong with the astrocytes, and they fail to reabsorb glutamate, which is a neurotransmitter, and it becomes toxic, and it will result in muscular weakness, difficulty speaking, swallowing, using your hands. Then you eventually die from this. In the United States, 10 to 12,000 people are paralyzed each year from spinal cord trauma. And that's usually a fracture of the vertebrae. Young men are our highest risk group, and over half of the injuries are caused by automobile or motorcycle accidents. Here are some of the things that can happen. If you have a complete transection, that means it's severed completely, of the spinal cord, you have immediate loss of motor control below that level. Now, if it's above C4, there again is a threat of respiratory failure. We have spinal shock, paralysis. Paraplegia is paralysis of both of the lower limbs. Quadriplegia, all four limbs. Hemiplegia is paralysis on one side of the body. And paresis is a partial paralysis or just weakness of the limbs. This concludes part 2. Part 3 will cover reflexes, and then we will be finished with chapter 13.